about such an extensive topic, we treat these seminars, these webinars as something where we can discuss the issue, talk about sort of the main topics, and then sort of indicate some additional literature or resources that we have about the topic. I see that there's even people who have worked on topics of TOD, for example, from CCAP, and then maybe at some point we can have you present or discuss something of what you've been doing previously. Okay, so then let's start by defining the problem. Let's say that the problem is essentially the same that we've seen in many other places, and it's the same that we've been talking about in different sort of topics. It's not only the problem of urban transport and urban development, it's the problem of essentially traveling, right? Generally, I start a presentation by sketching something in a piece of paper, and if it gets nicer later, then I have some time to make it nice. This time I didn't have the time yet, but the important thing is the message. Anybody who is leaving their house will have a purpose of their trip. And then it can be going to work, it can be running errands, it can be leisure of some kind, it can be studying, it can be many different things. What's important is that what we want to achieve is that the city is able to provide access to those needs. Not necessarily that the city provides roads for those needs, it's that the city provides a way for people to access those different needs. And one of the better ways of doing it is through urban development, and it's through urban planning, and it's through policies that improve the urban setting so that transport is not necessarily something absolutely necessary. This is really important. What this person is going to do to get to these different places, or to achieve these different needs, is not necessarily through transport, and it's not necessarily through a motorized vehicle, or not necessarily through a non-motorized vehicle. It is depending on the urban setting in which they live. And then we have another thing, which is this transport paradox. It's sort of the typical phrase, which means that the more development we have, the worse transport we tend to have. In developing countries, this happens a lot, and then we have to sort of bear in mind that this happens a lot. We have increased car ownership, we have increased traffic volumes, we have increased congestion, and we have to find a way to solve that, because otherwise we'll have also urban sprawl, more car dependency, increased trip lengths, and high cost for extended infrastructure and services. In addition to that, then we have other impacts in terms of climate change, global warming, high emission levels, and air pollution. We have other impacts in terms of road safety, and we have other topics in terms of energy consumption. During the time that we're going to be talking, that we're going to have some discussions on which are different methods to improve this, different projects which have been some ideas, and some are based in my country, Colombia, others are based in other places. Now we have different solutions, and those solutions are, for example, that we can have sustainable solutions, which over time we can achieve that sustainability. Essentially, in terms of transport, this means improving those schemes and creating these initiatives which improve accessibility and develop more effective transit cities. This is one of the solutions which we are going to be sort of discussing as one of those ways. More broadly, what we can see is that there is a traditional approach, which is known generally as the automobile approach. There is a sustainable approach, which can be known as a contemporary approach, which sort of tends to follow the knowledge that when we focus on motorized and individual travel, we will not have the best solution. And that's why we can sort of try and shift towards something which is more sustainable, more contemporary, and sort of more useful in terms of the impacts that we're going to have. This is because we have some trends, and then when you look at the pictures on the right, you see that there is a rapidly increase in car ownership and use. There is starting to be less and less use of public transport, walking and cycling, and we see some city centers which are decentralizing. People are leaving the city centers, and we have to sort of revert that. That trend happened not for free. It was basically because there was more infrastructure for cars, more space for motorized vehicles, and that started to generate a trend of less density, sprawl, and this was sort of, it is clearer and clearer every day that this is sort of unsustainable focused. Now, this is one example. You can find many, many different examples of this. If you compare this slide, which is showing, for example, how I could get to a specific location, which has very, very large blocks, we will have a situation where it's very difficult for me to arrive walking, even on a bicycle, because we have to do this very, very long trip, a very, very long walk, right? And then when you try to sort of try and solve it through urban planning and through the improvement of the urban space, for example, having shorter blocks, having greater networks, having more more connectivity between the different locations, this will generate shorter trips, and it will generate a greater it is an enabler to walk and cycle much more efficiently from one place to the other. So that is sort of a very, very quick description of how urban planning can improve conditions for people walking, not necessarily by redeveloping a whole city, but by doing things which are very, very concrete and which will reduce the necessity to travel considerably. And there is this spiral, which we have seen in different places, and this is sort of a remake of what the Wuppertal Institute did some years ago. What it says is that we have a lot of car traffic. That kind of car traffic tends to generate a perceived solution of having more land for roads, that generates more demand for those roads, that generates an increase in traffic, longer distances, and then sort of this increases and increases, and what you have is that you start making people who are walking to start getting motorized, or to try and motorize, or to sort of try and solve their daily needs with motorization. What's important here is that we have seen that cities tend to start trying and solving these problems with roads because they feel that roads are the solution. But what actually happens is that the creation of roads worsens the solution in the medium term and even more so in the long term. So then we have to sort of see, why do we have that, and how can we solve that, and how can we reduce sort of the tendency to try and solve traffic problems with more roads. The issue about having more roads and the issue about having sort of different infrastructure built in different cities is something where what you're having is a city which has a typical distance, and that typical distance will enable one mode or another. I mean, this is sort of an example of what could happen and what we could have. And what we want to have here is sort of try and be sort of into the smaller circles and try and have cities which can work based on travel within those smaller circles. Now, what can we do? I mean, one of those ways of solving this is to integrate land use policies and transport. This, I mean, I'm going to start and go through sort of the basics and then something which is more specifics. But what we want to do is to increase access to sustainable transport, to public transport, to walking and to cycling. We want to encourage people to travel short distances, to make fewer trips, and we want to encourage compact mixed-use development and to reduce the fuel and energy consumption. We cannot do this only by saying, just telling everybody go shorter distances. We also have to start finding ways through urban development to make this possible. And then we have to understand, first of all, that there is this relationship between mobility and then accessibility has to be that main aim. We have to try and ensure that accessibility. This message I've been repeating a lot. We have to have everybody being able to achieve their needs and to be able to access those needs. The way in which we arrive at that can be through urban transport, but it can also be through urban development and urban policies. And then that is sort of the way in which we have to start thinking about things. And we have to sort of understand that transport will be the way through which we enable those movements and through which we enable the fact that people can move and arrive at those different ways of accessing their different needs. And then there is sort of this linkage, this direct linkage between what is happening with the transport policies and what is happening in terms of the land use policies, and how we can sort of integrate the two, and how each of them is sort of linking their impacts and their measures and their different sort of solutions between each other. Now, there is an example which we use a lot, and it follows sort of this idea of compact land use and smart growth. Imagine that the person in the left needs to do shopping, needs to go shopping, right? So then there's three things that have to be solved. The first is that they have to solve that urban setting which they'll live. I mean, for example, the first thing they will think is, where will I go? Where will I get in order to do these groceries or to do this shopping? And that can only be solved through urban planning. After that, we have the other two, which are the modes that they're going to use, which depend on the availability of modes. And the end of it is what mode I'm going to use, and it is sort of which is the improvement of the technology, and that's the improved side. What we're going to focus on in this webinar is this avoid portion. It is the need to improve urban planning, urban policies, and sort of to arrive at a setting where people can easily arrive with a short distance and with few trips to where they need to go and to what they want to do. And then one way, sort of one of the models to achieve that is through the 3Ds. That's density, diversity, design. Sometimes I say it should be 4Ds, and the fourth D should be the espacio, but then I'm not sort of promoting my organization here. I'm just saying this is sort of the different components of the solution. Now the first one is density, right? And then this is taken by one work which we did along with Embark India, where we were sort of discussing this with Indian colleagues. So then the increase in density is something which has to be understood. In the case of at least the people who I see in the chat, there's many people who are from developing countries, not from Asia necessarily. So then it is safe to say that we can increase densities. The fact of Latin America is that it has sort of a moderate density. We could sort of start discussing what is the ideal density. And that is something relatively difficult to define. But we can sort of start to see that an adequate level of density is much better for improved transportation, right? It doesn't necessarily mean high-rise. If you look at the different densities in different cities, it doesn't have to be huge buildings, but it is sort of not one-floor buildings everywhere, right? So we can sort of start looking at how we can see that. We know that some Asian cities already have high densities. What we want to see is sort of in the case of Latin America, what is the density and how we can sort of increase that density or make it sort of more compact in general. One very good news is that historically cities have been compact, and that historically cities, I mean, if you have a historical center, then you already have good compact, good level of density in that place. I want to show something which is the population densities in different metropolitan areas. We're going to be posting this presentation later online, but then you can see, sort of try and see where your city is. If you look here towards above, then you see that this is all the United States, except for New York, which is here. And then you start looking at Asian cities are more towards below, and the Latin American cities are dispersed more or less in the middle, yeah? So this is one first issue we can see which is this population density of people per hectare. Now this is sort of a more graphical approach to see which is sort of that distribution of density in those sort of in the same scale. And then you can see that different cities have different densities dispersed throughout. What's interesting is to see that some cities like London don't seem to have an incredibly high density, but they do have actually a relatively high density, whereas Shanghai, for example, is very, very clear that it is a very high rise density overall. If you look at sort of in terms of the urban footprint and the density and the amount of people who live in a location, we can compare this example from Alain Berthaud, where he's looking at the actual urban footprint of Atlanta compared to Barcelona, and they have relatively the same amount of people in both, but in different areas. And you can see that it's more people in Barcelona than in Atlanta, and the people in Barcelona do not live, live happily, probably more happy than in Atlanta. I mean, for those of us who have been to both places, we could say that Barcelona is sort of better. And then in terms of sort of what it implies, what does it imply to have sort of a very, very dispersed area? We can see that with about the same population, 60% of the population of Barcelona is within 600 meters of a subway line. And it's incredible. I mean, that's what you want. Whereas to provide that same accessibility, Atlanta would have to build 3,400 kilometers of metro. You can imagine what that means in terms of energy consumption, in terms of capital cost of infrastructure, in terms of policy, and how we start to see that greater densities can be better for a city, not only in terms of efficiency, but in terms of cost, and in terms of many other things. Now, some sort of analysis have shown that there are very high costs of sprawl, and I'm just going to leave this here, and then later you can come back and look at this. But essentially, it is showing what is the cost of something, sort of the cost of the service of basic sort of emergency and schools and sewer per new household. And when it is a sprawl location, it is 15 times higher. This graph, I mean, everybody has seen this graph. For those of you who haven't, I think it's very useful to see. It shows the urban density of different cities in the world and transport-related energy consumption. Now, there's two ways of interpreting this graph. One way is that it's a curve, and that you can see that Hong Kong has very high urban density, very low energy consumption, whereas Houston has incredibly high energy consumption and very high sprawl. And there is sort of this sort of trend. Some people say that there should be sort of, there is one line here and there is another line here. But in any case, what we can see is that there is a breaking point where we can start seeing that there is sort of a lower energy consumption and a relatively higher density, and then we can sort of try and get people more towards this side. You can, I mean, getting this done is a little bit difficult to find for your specific city, but you can try and have something similar for your city if you want to sort of point out where your city is. And I would be happy to receive your data so that we can sort of plot it out in a new place. The second of these, other than density, is having mixed land use. The idea here is that we want to have a combination of land uses in the same area. What this means is that you can get a toothbrush, milk, a pencil, and going to school and maybe working within a location which is not more than 2 kilometers away, or not more than 3 kilometers away. I mean, in the end, what you want is to find urban settings which have very, very short distances, which can have very few trips or very short few trips. And this is achieved not only by density, but also by mixing land uses. Some people don't like this. In the specific case of Bogota, this is seen as something which is not necessarily good. But in general, it is sort of a complement of density. If you have high density but very large areas with the same use, you're not really getting the best out of it. You have to have both. And then Pascal sees Amsterdam, I think, at the left top, which is interesting to know that we already have locations there. I mean, to the extent that we can complement this mixed land use by sort of having a nice public realm, to have people sort of be able to do something along the way and where they are going is something which is very useful to see, right? And then essentially it is combining work, study, shopping services, reduce the need of excessive travel, more efficient use of land, and less investment on infrastructure. This is an example of what should not be done. It's having sort of retail in one place, always in another place, residential in another, and then when you look at how to get there, it's essentially through a road. So everybody lives here and they have to take a road in order to arrive at, if they need to buy a pencil, they have to take a car and go here. So it's an incredibly high amount of energy spent, it's an incredible amount of CO2 emitted, and we don't want to see that. We don't want to see people taking their car to arrive someplace else. They could have part of the retail here, they could have some of the offices here, and they could have some of the residential locations in these places. So that would be one way of sort of arriving at the best place. And these two are sort of pictures from very specific places in Europe, in Budapest. And it's the third D, which is design. And we would want to have this proper urban design to enable improved areas and greater participation in public space. Essentially, what we want is to have people to like where they're going. Not only have high densities and mixed land use, but for people to like where they are. This not only increases safety, but it increases the probability of people wanting to go to places which are near, right? And then that's sort of the third D, which is sort of more of an architectural issue, which you can sort of think about. How can we complement? And then the issue of land use and land policy integration to urban transport as such must be accompanied by other topics. These are not necessarily related to land use, but they will have a direct impact on that land policy integration. The first of these is NMT integration. And this example is from Transmilenio. This was the first location, I think, in the world where a BRT had a bicycle parking station linked to the actual station of BRT. So what you do here is that for the same cost of the ticket of Transmilenio, which is the BRT in Bogota, you can actually leave your bicycle completely guarded, registered, and continue your trip. What this enables is a greater coverage of public transport. What this enables is sort of a higher sort of probability of getting synergies between urban transport and urban development, which is very useful. I mean, we could talk about integration a lot. And actually, I think one of our previous presentations was talking about integration, and you can go back to that webinar and see what it was about. Another issue is integrating TDM. And what you can see here is one proposal of how we could do congestion pricing in Bogota in 2 phases along the different locations which would have high quality BRT in the vicinity of these areas. So what we did was we proposed in one specific project, that was Bogota 21, to integrate the possibilities of improving urban development with travel demand management. Congestion charging is one of these examples, not the example, and I think we can also do a webinar to see which are the different topics where we can discuss TDM and the different instruments. But there's parking policies, which is sometimes even more effective, fuel pricing, fuel policies, which can also complement these measures. And then we can have mass transit integration, which is essentially having different services which can increase the coverage of an area, which can increase the linkage between different areas. And this will be one way to not only make it feasible for people to have mixed land use, compact high densities, but also to link different areas in between themselves and to have them linked in such a way that that people can move in mass transit. It can be regular buses, BRT, light rail, heavy rail, suburban rail, whatever, depending on the needs, depending on the demand of each of the systems, and we can have sort of that, we can define what this is about. Now there are other ways in which we can start and link very clearly urban development, urban transport, and the policies that are in place. And this is one of those examples which was done in another project recently finished. And it's that you can, for example, have instruments where the development of urban land into something larger will increase the price, and part of that increase in price can be used to build part of this, right? To build the whole sort of scenario of not only roads for cars and buses, but just having sort of a more comprehensive approach towards urban development, and sort of having sidewalks and bicycles and sort of many different components of sustainable transport, which can be paid through the increase in land prices because of the improvement of urban development. Now, transit-oriented development is one very specific example through which we can start and do concrete implementation of urban development and urban transport project improvement. The essence of this is that you have, as we saw sort of these different areas. These areas would have sort of different densities, and you have transit stops. This can be a transit stops between mass rail transit or mass rapid transit or BRT or whatever. But what you want to have is very high density corridors, very high demand corridors, linking different areas, for example, neighborhoods, which have a decent high quality transit station. So then when you have that, then you can start and see how to link these, how to sort of generate these improved connections. And essentially what you have here is you have more destinations near those transit stations, you have better walking conditions, increased security, and you have sort of a more efficient operation overall for the system. And this is why we sort of push a little bit towards that direction, how to have and where to have TOD as the component which will be an effective way of increasing the integration between urban development and urban transport. You can improve that access through public transport, and you should essentially focus on high intensity development in locations that are best served by that public transport. So then this is sort of this synergy between what we have been seeing before. The example of Hong Kong is very clear. I mean, what you have is actually, this is the area of one station which not only has a TOD implementation, but apart from that, it also has value capture implementation. So what you see is that there is a location where people can not only have improved access to a station, the station was also built through the revenue from the development along the station. So it was sort of a no cost or very low cost to the developer to increase their access, and to the mass transit developer to implement their system. So this is sort of one of those examples which is very useful and positive. The case of Curitiba is one of those which is very, very frequently mentioned. So what they did is that they essentially said, okay, I have this corridor of BRT, and then I will allow and motivate people to develop urban settings, high-rise nearer to the BRT corridor, and then low-rise farther from the corridor. So what you end up having is what you see in the next slide. So you have the BRT corridor, and then you have very high densities along the BRT corridor, and the lower densities farther away from the corridor. So then you're concentrating development and high densities along the corridor, and sort of a next step could be sort of concentrating that along the stations by themselves. This is sort of an example which has sort of the BRT corridor on the left, and then you can see the rest of the city sort of lower rise development sort of as a complement, and as something very, very specific of concentrating most of the activity in the BRT corridor. So in Bogota there has been a lot of work recently. Let's say that this started a long time ago. One of those exercises was the one that was done with GIZ and others, which was called Bogota 21, and there was a proposal of having transit corridors, first of all sort of concentrating the city and the development of the city within the green belts, which already sort of exist, and then having sort of transit corridors which go out of that green belt, connected by high capacity transit to other nodes. So it's sort of starting to integrate even beyond the urban setting this proposal of having a concentrated city and then having something in the metropolitan region. Of course, this needs much more. There are some follow-up in sort of activities, both related and not related to this initiative of Bogota 21. And one of those is the one which was developed by CCAP in the US in conjunction with the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Urban Development, and Ministry of Environment, which is a NAMA on TOD. And it's essentially developing initiatives in the country, in Colombia in general, in order to have improved access of people to transit and to urban settings, and also have a reduction in emissions. So somebody, Esther, is asking now if the gray border is the border of the department. This is a very good question, Esther, and then I'm wondering if you're from Bogota or if you work with Bogota. But anyway, so the gray border, what it's showing is the border of the functional metropolitan area. And then what this is not the department, which is called Cundinamarca, that is larger, but it is the 17 municipalities and the 17 different urban settings which relates to Bogota functionally, which have a functional relationship in terms of work, in terms of movement, in terms of sort of every activity of the city. This is sort of a decision that was taken by that project. Other projects have started to talk about other areas, but this is sort of the more academically approved and to a certain extent technically and governmentally approved metropolitan area. Bogota does not have a metropolitan area, but this is sort of one of the ideas. Now, looking at sort of the impact of mass transit in Bogota, we can start to see that, sorry, I didn't respond to the complete question of Esther. She was asking if the other nodes are other cities, and yes, I mean each of these cities is Ipaquira, and then Chia, and then Facatativá, and other smaller cities or urban areas near Bogota. Those are the blue points, let's say. And then what I was saying now was that Transmilenio is the red line here, and then you can see this is an ad from a development agency, a developer and sort of somebody who builds properties along the city, and they're showing that their properties are near the trunk lines of Transmilenio, sort of sending a message saying, we are near trunk lines of Transmilenio or future trunk lines of Transmilenio. So that is a very strong message towards TOD as something which has effectively been seen. This is another example of a sort of a closer thing, more towards 2011. And this is sort of a result of a research which was done by the Universidad de los Andes, where they found that Bogota and its Transmilenio may have generated an increase in densities. The darker blue colors are high increase. The gray are reduction, so that you can see that in most of the areas, mostly towards the end of the trunk lines and the feeder services of Transmilenio, there has been an increase in Transmilenio, right? So then you can start to see something more specific in terms of that integration and sort of that the impacts of a mass transit system to the urban development and the sort of the impact on something which was not planned but rather sort of happened, and the market sort of responded to that as well. And then this is sort of a survey, part of a survey in 2010 where they're asking people what they like of the places that they go to live in, and then location is seen as something which has a very, very high percentage, especially in Bogota, which is a 43%, and then other places which have mass transit also. So that's to complement sort of that market-based approach. There's other examples of TOD. I mean, we can look at many, many different examples of TOD. We've seen Hong Kong, Bogota, you can see Bangkok is sort of somewhere where you're starting to see a lot of TOD. And then there's sort of different ways of looking at TOD. And what is important here is that TOD can be sort of something which is a message of different systems, and the message of trying to generate something where you are consciously integrating urban development policies with transport. You need to be conscious about that. You need to integrate everybody which is part of those urban policies and urban development so that you can get the best out of this. If you look at the examples in Bogota, this is market-led, this is market-led. I mean, it's not necessarily integrated in urban policy with an urban transport. Yeah, Manuel Santana is giving us a very good insight, which is based on the different research which has been done through Transmilenio, and then the issue of why Transmilenio has or has not generated more urban development, or more high-rise or more density. I think it does not have to do necessarily with Transmilenio, but more towards the integration of urban policies. I mean, if you look at the urban policies in Bogota and the urban transport policies in Bogota, you can start to see how you could make it a little bit better. There are other people who say technology is an issue in terms of if you have Transmilenio, this is a bus-based system, and then maybe a rail-based system could have other effects. But this, I mean, we cannot prove this yet, and it is sort of an opinion. But it is important to sort of start seeing how we can understand mass transit as something which cannot or should not be done as a project which is a standalone. It has to start to integrate itself into urban planning policies and sort of physically walking through the urban planning office and discussing with them which is the best way of arriving at this. And then the example of Transmilenio shows that the market responded very quickly, but then there was a lot of lost opportunities in Transmilenio. And this is sort of a discussion going on with, for example, SICAP, which we have said, let's see how we can find that, what is that sort of linkage between urban transport, urban development, which are the opportunities that have been lost, and how we can find a way of understanding how to get something better out of this. And then, so this is sort of the main overall insights of how to link urban transport and urban development. I'm sure that many of you have said, well, this is more or less what I've been talking before, this is not something very new. So it would be nice to see which of you would like to raise a question. I mean, I'm happy to open the microphone to whoever would like to speak, or just if anybody wants to sort of send a chat message, we can also discuss based on that. We can talk about your city specifically, how they're integrating or not, the challenges or the barriers that you may perceive in terms of having this integration, or any other sort of open question either related to this presentation, or sort of open to sort of the more broad topic of urban transport or to urban integration in general. So I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you have.
Yes, so thank you already, Carlos, for giving the presentation and for leading us up to the discussion part. Yeah, I think we are already in the middle of the discussion, and So we have already learned a lot today about how to reduce the need for transport by smart planning and how to reduce private motorized transport generally, which actually enables cities also to reallocate space more easily to pedestrians and to cyclists and to public transport systems. I remember especially also a comparison between Barcelona and Atlanta, which has been like a really good example for the enormous difference in energy consumption. So we have seen that to provide the same accessibility in Barcelona, which just requires a network of about 100 kilometers of metro lines, in Atlanta this would need about 3,400 kilometers of an urban transport system, which would probably not be a metro system, but rather a not so comfortable bus system in that way. Yes, so and also the concept of the 3Ds, I think, is something that we can remember very easily. Yeah, the density, diversity, and design. So the combination of trying to achieve a high density, which actually helps us to make public transport systems more efficient. The part of diversity, which practically means the concept of mixed land use planning. So it means that in a close surrounding, in a small area, we have a lot of different functions. May they be like for shopping, work-related, kindergartens, and places for education, and so on. And the design part, which actually is the design of the concrete urban road, which supports walking and cycling, or which also, if badly planned, may support rather car-oriented development. So this so far from my side. Please feel encouraged to raise further questions via the chat function, and if you would like to use the microphone as well, please just indicate this via the chat and we will enable you.
Yeah, okay, so Ernst is asking how the energy consumption is identified. I think that is an incredibly complex question to discuss here, but in the end, what you want to see, I'm going to see if I can find a slide which shows energy consumption parameters. But in the end, what you want to know is the distance which is traveled, the mode of transport which is used, and the emission factor of these modes. Yeah. So I mean, I have a presentation which I can quickly draw and show everybody, which we used for another webinar actually, and I can show you now. Okay, so it's here. Okay, so what you can see here in the screen is that there are 4 different items which are useful to sort of understand or find out energy consumption and CO2 emissions as well. So there's the activity, the structure, the intensity, and the fuel. And then this is useful to sort of, this is actually something on MRV, on monitoring, reporting, and verification of CO2 emissions. But essentially what you want to know is what is the activity that the person or the ton kilometer or person kilometer is doing, what is the mode in which they are moving, what type of engine and technology and sort of energy consumption they have, and then for the CO2 side, we can also see the carbon content of the fuel. So then these could be sort of, this is the first sort of idea of what we should think about. There is a very specific presentation on this, and then I can send you later the link of this presentation, which was a longer 1-hour session that could be useful for you to have this clear. And thank you for that question. There was also a question from Manuel. Transmilenio and urban segregation. Okay, so then this is also very interesting. I would like to take out a slide of the gentrification, but the issue of gentrification mainly comes from the discussion of if you have greater development along the corridor of public transport, you may have a very, very specific impact, which is very negative, and it is that people will be priced out of their places of work, for example, they have to go live someplace else. This has not been able to be proved very, very well in the case of Transmilenio, for example, but we know that greater increase in coverage and in access to public transport actually generates a greater increase in value, in land value, and if you do not have measures to reduce gentrification, of course you're going to be pricing out those people who were initially where you were trying to get people to actually get better coverage of sustainable transport. So what happens is that a public transport is improved for the poor, but what you end up getting is people who have to live farther away because of that segregation and because of that gentrification. The topic has a little bit, or has some research, a lot of research in general, sort of gentrification in general. In public transport, there is not so much as one would want, but there are sort of very positive examples. One nice and positive example is one of Chun in the case of Hong Kong. And what Hong Kong did in that case was that they had a location which was essentially developed as TOD. And then when they developed this as TOD, they also included a concrete implementation where people were not only living in very high income places, but that they would also have the chance to build buildings for people in low income areas. So I'm going to show you one of these examples as well from another presentation, if I can find it. But essentially the important thing here is that there are ways of improving and increasing access for people who have low income through the development of TOD and through the development of different projects of not only high income, but also combining it between high income and low income areas. I couldn't find the presentation, but there are some examples which are also positive. And then urban sprawl. Yeah, tadanan. So the important thing of urban sprawl is that, I mean, when you were looking at, for example, the example of Bogota is also very useful. I don't know exactly what is happening today in Barcelona, but I can describe Bogota sort of as that example. So essentially what is happening in Bogota is the following. Today, what you have is a lot of people living inside Bogota, but this concept of this greenbelt has not been implemented, and this metropolitan area has not been implemented either. So what you're getting is, you're not getting sprawl in Bogota, you're getting sprawl-like development in all of these places. And then you can see that people living here are actually coming to Bogota, people living here are coming to Bogota, and others coming here are also coming to Bogota. So this generates very long trips of people who are living in locations which are residential only, promoted essentially by the governments of these cities, because what they want is for people to go live there and to pay taxes there. So what you have to do in the case of Bogotá especially, and probably this is the case for the metropolitan area of Barcelona, is that the policies of urban development that you have implemented here should be also related to what is happening here and should be implemented in the broader metropolitan region. And also, I mean, this is a discussion which we still have in Bogotá. The green belt is something which we have proposed in the Bogotá 21 project, especially to avoid huge areas and huge urban areas of one city, but rather to start linking different places properly. And then that can be a solution to urban sprawl, and that can be a solution to get to a policy where it's not just about increasing people living in a city or increasing the coverage or public transport, but it's also about intelligently linking these different places. And then, I mean, now the question of how to get back to a compact development is much, much more difficult to answer. Because what you have in some place which is essentially compact is that you see, for example, if you look at the example of Atlanta or Detroit or wherever, trying to sort of generate the Atlanta of 1920 in this place, it essentially means that you have to sort of start generating centralities, and then that everything happens in one area and everything happens in another area and then another area. So what you have to start doing is sort of some sort of urban acupuncture, so that areas by themselves and neighborhood by themselves have activity and people can access all their needs and can satisfy all their needs in a specific area, not having to go from one place to the other corner of the city, but actually being able to move in the specific area and developing specific land policies that enable sort of the possibility of having residential, commercial, and then office, and then all these different purposes of land use in the same sort of neighborhood, for example. That could be a way. I mean, it will take ages, and then most probably having the density, diversity, and design implemented in very specific areas, and then linking it through different sort of modes of transport and mass transit generally, sort of will help you get there, right? So then to the extent that you can have sort of these centralities, having this as a centrality and having that centrality strengthen its vocation as an urban setting where you can get everything you need. But for example, if you need to buy a vintage music machine or rocola, I mean, you can get there also. I mean, there are many needs which may be able to be satisfied by traveling from here to here or from here to the next station. But this is only for a minor portion of the trips. So what you want to have something like this. Okay, before everybody sort of says, okay, this is getting too long, I think we're going to wrap up, and then we want to give people also the chance to respond to a survey, which I'm going to sort of send the link of the survey, if that is okay, Matthias, because we have developed a survey for these webinars, and then I think the best is that you take 5 minutes now to respond to the link that I'm sending much. So I leave the floor to you, Matthias, and I've sent the link now to everyone.
Okay, all right. So thank you, Carlos, once more for the great presentation and also for replying to all the questions. I would have done actually the same now, so please feel encouraged to answer to the short survey. This is really important for us because, of course, it will help us to improve our SUTP webinar series also in the future. So you can also indicate there, for example, which topic would be specifically interesting for you. Maybe to also show some further sources, because assembled some slides which give us some further links to documents which would be important. So I will quickly change the screen to my presentation.
Yeah, please.
Okay. And I'll make it full screen and hope that it works. Yeah, page 50. That's Yes, so if you would like to read more about the connection of land use planning and also transport demand management, there is like an entire chapter of the Sustainable Urban Transport Project, which you will find actually on SUTP.org. You will later on receive the presentation, and there are all the links directly included. Another document which is worthwhile reading is the TOD standard from ITDP, as well as the Bus Rapid Transit Guide gives some important implication about good planning of mass rapid transit systems, and gives a lot of indications for integrated urban development and transport. Another nice gimmick or another nice thing to explore is actually the also presentation, which was developed by our colleagues which are working in the field of urban transport in Beijing. This is also helpful, and you may use it actually also for own presentations and explore more about the principles of sustainable urban transport. Also, I would like to inform you about our new offer. Sorry, there's something weird about the presentation screen. I would like to shortly inform you about the Capsule platform, which is compiling a lot of information about free webinars, free trainings, which are available online and which are taking place in different areas. And all organizations or everyone may feel invited to place and advertise his or her webinar on the page of capsule.org. You will also... Yeah?
In the meantime, I'm copying every link because then you can actually click on it.
All right. Great. Yeah, if you would also like to explore more about us, you will find all the links then later on as well in the presentation. So we will find us also on Facebook and Twitter, on the official GIZ webpage. Just add a slash and the word transport. And again, there's this weird screen. I'm sorry for this. Yes, and I'm sorry, I'm facing some technical problems, and I'm now at some completely different slides. Yes, and so on this slide you will find out further sources on all our work. So please just let me thank for your attendance and for your attention, and the presentation and the recordings themselves will be made available soon at capsule.org. We will also share all the links then later on via email to all the participants. So if you have any further questions, also please don't hesitate to contact us via email. So either contact Carlos or you contact me directly via mail.
Yeah, and thank you very much to everyone. Bye.
Okay, goodbye to everyone, also from our side.
Okay. So closing now. Bye.